Here's something nobody tells you about getting older. It's not the gray hair or the knees that pop like bubble wrap every time you stand up. It's pulling up to your own $720,000 lake house after the best duck hunting weekend of your life, cooler full of birds in the back of the truck, heart full of quiet satisfaction, and watching your key refuse to turn in the front door. I sat there in the driveway for a second, engine still ticking as it cooled. The October wind off Lake Minnetonka, rattling the golden leaves like nature itself was trying to warn me. The sun was already low, painting everything in that soft Minnesota autumn light that makes even an old retired engineer like me feel poetic for half a second. I'd driven 3 hours from the blinds up near Alexandria, with 6 beautiful mallards and 2 wood ducks, the kind of haul that usually has me whistling the whole way home. Today I wasn't whistling. I was just staring at my own front door like it had suddenly grown a personality and decided it didn't like me anymore. Jack Harlan, 66 years old. Former civil engineer who spent 38 years building bridges and highways that still stand strong in 3 states. I once parallel parked an 18-wheeler in downtown Minneapolis during rush hour just to prove a point to a stubborn contractor. And now here I was, sitting in my own driveway like some kid who forgot his house key. I climbed out, boots crunching on the gravel I'd laid myself 10 years ago. The air smelled like pine and cold water, and a hint of wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. I loved that smell. It always meant home. I grabbed the cooler, the weight of it solid and reassuring against my leg, and walked up the 3 wide steps I'd poured, and finished with non-slip texture, so Laura wouldn't slip when the first snow came. I slid the key into the lock. Nothing. I jiggled it. Nothing. I pulled it out, looked at it like maybe it had changed shape on the drive home, then tried again. Still nothing. The deadbolt didn't even budge. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, the words fogging in the cold air. Before you laugh, and I know some of you already understand this, I had just spent 3 perfect days in a blind with Hank Whitaker, my best friend since the army, shooting ducks, drinking terrible coffee, and talking about nothing important. I was supposed to walk through that door a hero. Laura would pretend to complain about the smell of the birds, while secretly loving that I still brought home dinner, the old-fashioned way. Ethan, my son, would probably roll his eyes and ask if I'd finally shot a limit this time. That was the script. That was how Fridays after a hunting trip were supposed to go in the Harlan house. Instead, I was standing on my own porch like a Jehovah's Witness who'd forgotten his pamphlets. I tried the key one more time. Slower. Like maybe the lock just needed a little persuasion. The metal scraped but didn't catch. I stepped back, looked at the door the way I used to look at a set of blueprints when something didn't line up. Same heavy oak I'd chosen myself. Same brass handle I'd polished 100 times. Same security system panel glowing green on the wall, which meant the power was on and the alarm hadn't been tripped. Everything looked exactly right. Except the lock wouldn't turn. I set the cooler down with a soft thud. My back was starting to ache from the long drive. But that wasn't what made my chest feel tight. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that happens right before something you don't want to hear gets said out loud. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my face in the growing dusk. Ethan's name sat at the top of my recent calls. 32 years old, and still my only kid. I hit dial. It rang twice, which, if you know Ethan, means he was already waiting for the call. He never picks up on the first ring. Says it makes him look too eager. Kid's been playing that game since he was 16. "Hey, Dad." His voice had something in it. Something careful. Like a man testing thin ice with every word. "Ethan," I said, keeping my tone even, the same tone I used on job sites when a concrete pour was going sideways. "I'm standing on the porch. My key doesn't work." Silence. On the other end. Not the normal, "I'm driving" silence. This was the heavy kind. "Dad, we need to talk." I looked out across the lake. The water was glass still, reflecting the last pink streaks of sunset. Somewhere a loon called once. Low and lonely. I'd built this house with my own hands well. with my own plans and my own crew 22 years ago. Every board, every nail, every decision about where the windows should face so Laura could watch the sunrise from the kitchen. This was supposed to be the place I grew old in, the place where grandkids would run around someday. Son, I said, I just drove 3 hours with a cooler full of ducks. My neck is sunburned even though it's October. My back hurts. We can talk, but make it fast and make it make sense. I heard him exhale. We sold the house, Dad. The words landed like a sandbag on my chest. For half a second, I waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. The wind picked up, rattling the wind chimes. Laura hung, last spring. I looked down at the key still in my hand. The one I'd carried on the same key ring since 2003. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in that quiet, dark corner I'd been trying to ignore for 8 months, something clicked into place. Oh, I thought, it's starting. I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Slow, hesitant. I turned around and there was Laura. My Laura. 34 years of marriage, walking up the porch steps with her hands clasped in front of her like she was approaching a crime scene. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She'd been crying, and she was trying very hard not to let me see it. Jack, she said softly. I looked at her. Really looked. And I saw everything. The way her shoulders were pulled tight, the slight tremble in her bottom lip she always gets right before she decides she's not allowed to fall apart. She knew. She'd known for a while. And in that moment, standing on my own porch with a cooler full of ducks and a locked door, and my wife looking at me like I might disappear any second, I realized something nobody ever tells you about getting older. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you lose. It's realizing you planned to lose it, and you just forgot you were the one who drew up the plans. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, the words came out on their own. What the hell is going on? What the hell is going on? I said it out loud this time, the words hanging in the cold October air like they didn't want to leave. The phone was still pressed to my ear. Ethan hadn't answered yet. The line was quiet, except for the faint sound of traffic in the background on his end. I could picture him sitting in that little apartment he rented after the startup went sideways, probably staring at the same cracked ceiling he'd been staring at for the last 6 months. Finally, he spoke. Dad, we need to talk. I leaned against the porch railing, the wood smooth under my palm from years of me sanding and sealing it every spring. We are talking, son. I'm standing here with a cooler full of ducks and a key that doesn't fit my own damn door. So start explaining. He exhaled, long and shaky. I knew that sound. It was the same one he made when he was 17 and had to tell me he'd wrecked the truck. Careful. Practiced. Like he'd rehearsed this conversation in the mirror. Mom and I, we sold the house. The words hit me harder the second time. I looked out over the lake. The water was turning dark as the sun dropped behind the trees. The last streaks of orange bleeding into the sky. This lake had been my backyard for 22 years. I'd taught Ethan to skip stones here. I'd proposed to Laura right down by that old dock that still creaked when you walked on it. And now, it wasn't mine anymore. I kept my voice steady. You sold my house. Our house, Dad. We sold it. It's done. I could hear Laura's footsteps now. Slow on the gravel path that led up from the side yard. She was coming around the corner of the house, hands clasped tight in front of her the way she did when she was trying not to fall apart. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the kind of red that comes from crying for hours and then trying to hide it with cold water and willpower. I didn't look at her yet. I kept my eyes on the lake. Ethan, I drove 3 hours today. I've got 6 mallards and 2 woodies in that cooler. My neck is fried even though it's October. My back is killing me. And you're telling me you sold the house I built? Dad, please. It wasn't like that. We had to. Had to. I repeated the words like they were foreign. Explain that part to your old man. Laura reached the bottom step. She stopped there, looking up at me like I was made of glass. I finally met her eyes. 34 years of marriage, and I could read every line on her face. She knew. She'd known longer than I had. Ethan's voice cracked a little. The doctor's appointments. The tests. You told us 8 months ago what was coming. You made us promise, Dad. You sat us both down in the kitchen and said when the time came, when you started forgetting the important stuff, we had to act fast, before you fought us on it, before you tried to handle everything yourself like you always do. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Like a puzzle piece sliding into a slot I'd been pretending wasn't there. I made you promise, I said slowly. Yeah, you did. And we kept it. The buyers wanted to close fast. Cash offer, full price. We used the power of attorney you signed. It's all legal, Dad. The money's in a trust already. Marcus handled everything. Marcus. My lawyer. Of course. Laura took one step up. Then another. She was close enough now that I could smell the faint lavender from the hand cream she always used. Her chin was trembling the way it did when she was holding back tears, but had already decided she wasn't allowed to cry in front of me. I lowered the phone but didn't hang up. Ethan was still talking. Something about how they thought it would be easier on me this way. How the new place was smaller, easier to manage, closer to doctors. I wasn't really hearing the words anymore. Laura reached out and touched my arm. Gentle. Like she was afraid I might break. Jack, she whispered, voice thick. We sold the house. The phone slipped a little in my hand. Ethan was still talking on the other end, but the only thing I could hear was the wind in the leaves and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. My lake, my house, my life, and somewhere in the back of my mind, that quiet, dark corner whispered again, "This is exactly what you asked them to do." I looked at Laura. Really looked. The red rims around her eyes, the way she was holding her breath, the slight tremor in her fingers on my sleeve. She knew I was starting to forget things. She knew I'd planned for this moment, and she'd still cried for days before they changed the locks. I swallowed hard. Ethan, I said into the phone, my voice quieter now. Put your mother on the line for a second. But Laura was already shaking her head. She didn't need the phone. She was right here, standing on the porch of the house that wasn't ours anymore, looking at me like she was waiting for me to disappear right in front of her eyes. And in that moment I realized the worst part wasn't that they'd sold the house. The worst part was that I'd been the one who drew up the blueprints for my own disappearance, and I'd forgotten I was the architect. Laura's voice was barely above a whisper, but it landed like a hammer on glass. Jack, we sold the house. The words hung there between us, mixing with the cold lake air and the faint smell of pine needles. I stood frozen on the porch steps, cooler still at my feet. Key still clenched in my fist, like it might magically start working if I just believed hard enough. For a second, I waited for the punchline, for the part where she'd laugh and say she was kidding, that the lock was just jammed, that everything was fine. There was no punchline. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the toll it had taken. 34 years of marriage, and I knew every micro-expression on that face. The way her shoulders were pulled up tight, the red rims around her eyes that no amount of cold water could hide. The slight tremble in her bottom lip she always got right before she decided she wasn't allowed to cry in front of me. She was holding it together by a thread, and that thread had my name on it. I didn't explode. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do any of the things the old Jack Harlan would have done at 40 or even 50. Instead, I just stood there, the weight of the cooler and the weight of the moment pressing down on me at the same time. Sold it, I repeated, tasting the word. It felt foreign. Like someone else's life. Laura nodded once, small and ashamed. The buyers wanted to close fast. Cash offer. Full asking price. Marcus handled the paperwork. We used the power of attorney you signed last March. March. The word hit like a quiet thunderclap. 8 months ago. The doctor's office. The aggressively cheerful potted plant by the window that I always suspected was fake. Doctor, Ellis leaning forward with that gentle but devastating voice, saying the words I'd been pretending not to hear. Early-stage Alzheimer's. Progressive. Manageable for now. But we need to plan. I'd planned. I'd sat Ethan and Laura down in this very kitchen back when it was still our kitchen and laid it all out like a construction schedule. Blueprints for my own disappearance. Power of attorney. Trust fund. Instructions. When the time comes, I'd told them, don't let me fight you. Don't let me become the stubborn old man who thinks he can handle everything. Just do it. For me. For all of us. And then I'd forgotten I'd ever asked them to do it. The irony tasted like metal in the back of my throat. Laura took one more step up the porch. Close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there last year. She reached out and touched my sleeve. Fingers light, almost afraid I'd pull away. Jack, we thought it would be easier if you didn't have to make the decision when things got worse. You were so clear back then. You said you wanted us to act while you were still you. I looked past her toward the lake. The last light was gone now. The water had turned black and glassy, reflecting the first stars. Somewhere out there, a loon called once, low and mournful. I'd always loved that sound. Tonight, it felt like the lake itself was saying goodbye. I remember, I said quietly. Most of March anyway. She almost smiled at that, the same almost smile she'd given me for 34 years when my humor was the only armor I had left. You told us not to tell you when the time came. You said you'd fight it. You said you'd make it harder on everyone. You made us promise. I exhaled, long and slow. The air fogged in front of me. Part of me wanted to be angry. The old Jack would have been furious, voice raised, finger-pointing, the whole Ted Branson-style meltdown. But this version of me, this version, just felt tired, and strangely, quietly relieved. Because deep down, in that corner of my mind that still worked most days, I knew they'd done exactly what I'd asked. I set the key down on the railing. It clinked softly against the wood. So, the house is gone. Laura nodded. Closing was yesterday. The new owners move in next week. We kept some of the furniture. The things you love most. Your workbench in the garage, the rocking chair on the back porch. All the photos. Everything that matters is already at Ethan's place. We found a smaller house. One level. Closer to the clinic. Easier. I sat down on the top step, suddenly feeling every one of my 66 years. The wood was cold through my jeans. Laura sat beside me without being asked. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Just the wind in the leaves and the distant sound of the lake lapping at the shore. I should be mad, I said finally. You're allowed to be, she whispered, but I'm not. I looked at her. I'm just sad. And maybe a little proud of you two for actually going through with it. I know how hard that must have been. Her hand found mine. Her fingers were icy. I wrapped mine around them, trying to warm them the way I'd done 1,000 times before. Jack, she said, voice breaking just a little. You planned this so we wouldn't have to watch you lose everything piece by piece. You wanted to make it clean. You wanted to protect us. I nodded slowly. The memory was coming back clearer now, sitting at the kitchen table, with the paperwork spread out like battle plans. Me telling them, voice steady, that when the forgetting started to win, they had to act. No hesitation. No waiting for me to argue. And then I'd forgotten I'd ever said it. The cruelest part of this disease isn't the big things it takes. It's the way it steals the small things first, the promises you made, the love you tried to protect, the plans you built so carefully, and leaves you standing on your own porch, wondering why the door won't open. I squeezed Laura's hand. 8 months ago, I made you promise. She nodded, tears finally slipping free. You did. And in that moment, sitting on the porch of a house that wasn't ours anymore, with a cooler full of ducks at our feet, and the Minnesota night closing in around us, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not fear, just the quiet, heavy understanding that the plan I'd built to protect my family had finally, quietly, started to work. Laura's hand was still in mine, cold but steady, when the memory hit me like a freight train rounding a blind curve. 8 months ago, March 14th. The sky had that same steel-gray Minnesota color it gets in early spring. The kind that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I'd driven myself to Dr. Ellis's office alone, telling Laura I was just going for a routine blood pressure check. I didn't want her there yet. Not until I knew for sure. I sat in that familiar exam room with the aggressively cheerful potted plant by the window. The one I was convinced was plastic. Until I touched a leaf and realized it was real. Dr. Ellis came in with her usual calm smile, the kind doctors wear when they're about to hand you something you can't put back on the shelf. She pulled up the chair beside me instead of sitting behind the desk. That was my first clue. "Jack," she said, voice gentle but direct, "the latest scans and cognitive tests are consistent with early-stage Alzheimer's disease." The words landed flat, like someone had dropped a stone into still water. I didn't interrupt. I just nodded. The same way I used to nod when a contractor told me a bridge beam was going to be delayed. Facts first. Emotions later. She laid it out plain. Memory lapses that would get worse. The small things disappearing, first names, where I put my keys, the conversation I had yesterday. Then bigger things. Eventually, the big things. But right now, she said, we still had time. Time to plan while I was still sharp enough to make the decisions that mattered. I asked the only question that counted. How long before I stopped being me? She didn't flinch. I respected her for that. It varies. Some people have years of good function. Others move faster. In your case, the progression looks moderate. But we need to be proactive. Planning now is the most powerful thing you can do. Planning. That word was my language. I'd spent 38 years planning bridges that still stand in blizzards and highways that carry thousands of cars every day. So I went home that afternoon and did what I do best. I made a plan. I called Marcus Reed the next morning. 22 years he'd been my lawyer, the man who'd handled my father's estate, my contracts. The one time a neighbor tried to sue me over a property line. When I walked into his office, he took one look at my face and closed the door without being asked. I laid it all out. Power of attorney. Healthcare directive. A trust that would handle the house sale and medical costs. A memory care fund. And then I told him the hardest part. When the forgetting really starts, Marcus, I don't want to be the stubborn old fool fighting my own family. I want them to act. Clean and quick. Before I can argue, before I can make it harder on them. Marcus didn't blink. He just nodded and started drafting. That same night I sat Ethan and Laura down at the kitchen table, the one we'd bought the year Ethan turned 10. I spread the papers out like blueprints. I looked them both in the eye and said the words I'd practiced in the truck on the way home. I've been diagnosed with early Alzheimer's. It's not going away. But right now, I'm still me. And while I'm still me, I'm asking you no. I'm telling you when the time comes and I start slipping, you sell the house. You move me somewhere manageable. You do it without waiting for my permission because I will fight you. I will swear I'm fine. And I won't be. So promise me, you'll do it anyway. Ethan's face went pale. Laura's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. She just reached across the table and took my hand the way she always does when the world feels too heavy. Dad, Ethan said, voice cracking. Are you sure? I'm sure right now, I told him. And right now is all I've got. They promised. Both of them. Laura with quiet strength, Ethan with the fierce loyalty of a son who still thought his father was unbreakable. I made them repeat it. I made them sign the papers right there at the table. And then, because the universe apparently has a sense of humor sharper than any knife, I forgot I'd ever asked them to do it. Back on the porch, The memory faded as fast as it had come. Laura was still holding my hand. The cooler of ducks sat at our feet, like a silent witness. The lake was nothing but black glass now, reflecting a thin slice of moon. "I remember now," I said quietly. "The kitchen table, the papers, the promise I made you both keep." Laura's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. "You were so clear that night, Jack. You said you wanted us to protect you from yourself. You said you'd hate us for it later, and that was okay because you'd still be somewhere in there, loving us for doing it." I let out a short laugh that didn't have much humor in it. "I always did think I was the smartest guy in the room." She squeezed my fingers. "You still are. Most days." I looked down at our joined hands. My knuckles were starting to look like my father's, thick, scarred from years of real work. For the first time in months, the weight in my chest felt a little lighter. Not gone. Just shared. "I made you promise," I said again, softer this time. "You did." And in that moment I realized something that cut deeper than any diagnosis. The scariest thing about losing your mind isn't forgetting where you put your keys. It's forgetting that you once loved your family enough to build them a safety net, and then watching them use it while you stand there, wondering why the door won't open. I pulled Laura closer until her head rested on my shoulder the way it used to on long drives when Ethan was small and asleep in the back seat. The wind off the lake carried the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the shore. And then, I whispered into her hair, "I forgot I ever asked them." The next morning arrived too bright and too quiet. I woke up in the guest room at Ethan's apartment, the same room that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and someone else's life. Sunlight sliced through the blinds and painted stripes across the ceiling. For a few seconds I just lay there, staring at the unfamiliar light fixture, letting the events of last night settle in my bones like cold lake water. The porch, the locked door, Laura's red-rimmed eyes, the confession, the memory of the kitchen table 8 months ago. All of it came back in pieces, but the pieces fit. I remembered enough to know I had to move. I got dressed in the same flannel shirt I'd worn yesterday. It still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and duck feathers, and made coffee in Ethan's tiny kitchen. Laura was already up, sitting at the counter with her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked at me the way people look at a fragile antique they're afraid might shatter. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice light. "I'm driving to Marcus's office." She nodded once, no argument. We both knew this next step had to happen while the memory was still fresh, while I was still the version of Jack Harlan who could walk into a lawyer's office and handle his own disappearance like it was just another construction project. I kissed the top of her head, grabbed the truck keys, and headed out. The drive across the Twin Cities was the kind of crisp October morning that makes Minnesota feel like the only place on earth. Leaves blazed red and gold along the freeway. The air coming through the cracked window smelled like frost and pine and possibility. I kept both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the same way I'd taught Ethan when he was 16. Old habits die hard, even when your brain is starting to forget the rules. Marcus Reed's office sat in a quiet brick building in Street Paul, the kind of place that smelled like old wood, good coffee, and serious decisions. I'd been coming here for 22 years. He'd handled my father's estate, my contracts, the one time a neighbor tried to sue me over a property line back in '09. Marcus was the kind of man who never raised his voice and never needed to. When he spoke, you listened. I parked in the small lot behind the building and sat in the truck for a minute, engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. My hands were steady on the wheel. That was something at least. Inside, the receptionist smiled, the same professional smile she always gave me. "Mr. Harlan, Marcus is expecting you." He was already standing when I walked into his office. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who looks like he could have been a judge if he'd wanted the robe. Today, his face was quieter than usual, serious in a way that made the air feel thicker. "Jack," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, the same as always. "Sit down," I sat in the leather chair I'd sat in 100 times before. The room smelled like old books and fresh coffee. A thick manila folder waited on the desk between us, labeled in my own handwriting from 8 months ago. Harlan. Final instructions. Marcus didn't waste time with small talk. He never did when it mattered. You called me yesterday, he said. After the porch. I nodded. I remembered enough. He studied me for a long second. The same way he'd studied me the day I first told him about the diagnosis. Then he reached for the folder. Before we go through everything, he said, lacing his fingers together the way he does when he's about to deliver something heavy. I need to ask you something. Do you remember coming to see me 8 months ago? I held his gaze. Most of it. The kitchen table. The papers. The promise I made Laura and Ethan keep. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were documents I vaguely recognized: power of attorney, trust papers, healthcare directives. And on top of the stack, a plain white envelope with my own handwriting across the front. For Jack. Open when you've forgotten you wrote this. My stomach tightened. Not fear exactly. More like standing at the edge of a photograph and recognizing the man in it, but not quite feeling like him anymore. Marcus slid the envelope across the desk toward me. His voice was low and careful. You wrote this to yourself, Jack. The day you were clearest. The day you were most afraid you might lose this version of you. I stared at my own handwriting. Firm. Slightly impatient. The way I write when I have too much to say and not enough time to say it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should feel, like it contained a piece of me that was still whole, reaching across 8 months to grab the collar of the man I was becoming. I picked it up. My fingers traced the letters of my own name. Marcus leaned back in his chair, giving me the privacy of pretending he wasn't in the room. The only sound was the soft hum of the heating vent and the distant traffic outside. I turned the envelope over in my hands once, then twice, and in that quiet wood-paneled office that smelled like coffee and serious decisions, I realized this was the moment the plan I'd built finally started talking back. Marcus watched me, his expression unreadable except for the smallest crease of concern at the corner of his eyes. You wrote this to yourself, Jack. I stared at the envelope like it might bite me. My own handwriting stared back firm, slightly impatient, the same way I used to sign blueprints when a deadline was breathing down my neck. For Jack. Open. When you've forgotten you wrote this. Marcus sat perfectly still across the desk, giving me the kind of silence only a lawyer who's seen everything can give. The office smelled like old wood and fresh coffee, the kind of smell that says serious things happen here and nobody's in a hurry to leave until they're finished. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore it open. The paper inside was thick, the kind I always bought for important letters. 2 pages. I unfolded the first one slowly. The way you might open a letter from someone you haven't seen in years. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. No hesitation marks. No crossed-out words. Just a man talking straight to the page like he was running out of runway. Jack, if you're reading this, you forgot. That's okay. You planned for that too. I had to stop right there. The words hit like a quiet punch to the sternum. Even written down, I could hear my own voice from 8 months ago. Steady. Practical. A little bossy. The version of me that still had everything locked in place was reaching across time to grab the collar of the man I was becoming. By now, Ethan has done what you asked. He's probably terrified he did the wrong thing. Tell him he didn't. Tell him you're proud of him. He needs to hear it more than you think. You've never been great at saying it out loud, and you know that. I felt my throat tighten. 8 months ago, I'd sat at that kitchen table and made my son promise to sell the house I loved more than almost anything. And now here I was, reading my own instructions telling me to forgive him for it. Laura is holding it together because that's what she does. But she's not okay, Jack. She hasn't been okay since March. Don't let her keep pretending. You always let her carry things quietly because it was easier than asking. Don't do that anymore. You don't have the luxury of easy anymore. My jaw clenched. 34 years of marriage, and the man I used to be still knew exactly where to press. I could picture Laura on the porch last night, red-rimmed eyes, trying so hard not to cry in front of me. I'd let her do that for months. I'd let her carry the weight because admitting I needed her to felt like losing. The house is handled. The money is handled. Dr. Ellis has everything she needs. Marcus has the rest. You don't need to worry about the logistics. You already did. You were always good at logistics. Even when you were terrible at everything else. A short laugh escaped me dry, surprised. Marcus glanced up but didn't say a word. What I need you to do now is simpler and harder. I need you to stop being embarrassed. I need you to let Ethan be your son, without you trying to manage how he sees you. I need you to sit in the same room as Laura without performing. She married Jack Harlan. Not the version that has everything under control. The real one. And I need you to enjoy whatever time you have left that looks like normal, because normal is going to start getting expensive pretty soon. Don't waste it being stoic. You were never actually as tough as you pretended. You just had good posture. I sat there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. The man who wrote this had been scared. I could feel it between the lines, the fear he'd tried to bury under practical instructions and dry humor, but he'd also been clear-eyed. Clearer than I felt right now. I kept reading. P.S. The ducks in Alexandria are better up near the north blinds, not the main marsh. You probably already figured this out, but just in case, I folded the page slowly, carefully. The way you handle something precious you're not sure you deserve anymore. My eyes burned. Not tears exactly, not yet, but something close. The kind of burn that comes when you meet a version of yourself who was braver than you give him credit for. Marcus finally spoke, voice low. You okay? I looked up at him. The office felt smaller somehow. The aggressively cheerful plant in the corner rustled faintly from the heating vent. The man who wrote that letter, I said slowly, was considerably wiser than I currently feel. Marcus almost smiled. Almost. In 22 years I could count on one hand how many full smiles I'd gotten out of him. That man was you, Jack. 8 months ago. Still you. I folded the letter again and slid it back into the envelope, pressing the flap down like I could somehow seal the past self inside where he'd stay safe. My chest felt full in a way I couldn't name, not quite sadness. Not quite relief. More like standing on the edge of a bridge I'd designed myself and realizing for the first time how strong the cables really were. Marcus reached for the rest of the folder. There are some things we need to go over. Timelines, care arrangements, the transition plan for the house. Ethan is listed as primary. Laura has full oversight. You were very thorough. Of course I was. I was a logistics man. He paused, something shifting in his voice. You also left instructions for how you want to be spoken to when things get further along. What you want people to call you. What music you want playing. What you don't want said in front of you. I hadn't expected that one. I'd left a playlist? Marcus nodded once. Mostly Sinatra. You said you always had excellent taste. I let out a short laugh that actually sounded like me. The tension in the room eased just a fraction. Then Marcus leaned forward slightly, eyes steady. There's a second page, Jack. But I was told to give it to you only when you're ready. I left Marcus's office with the first letter folded carefully in my inside jacket pocket. Right against my chest, like a second heartbeat. The afternoon light had shifted to that soft golden October glow that makes even city streets look forgiving. I sat in the truck for a long minute, engine idling, before I pulled out my phone and sent the text I never thought I'd send. Tonight. Your place. Dinner. All of us. No excuses. Ethan replied in under 30 seconds. Laura answered even faster. They both said yes. By 6:30, I was standing outside Ethan's apartment door with 2 grocery bags and a bottle of the decent red wine Laura likes. My hands weren't shaking. That felt like a small victory. Inside, the place smelled like garlic and simmering tomatoes. Ethan had thrown together his mother's old lasagna recipe, the one she used to make when he was a kid, and the world felt safe. The small dining table was set with mismatched plates and the good silverware we'd managed to keep from the house. Laura had brought flowers, simple white chrysanthemums from the grocery store, but she'd arranged them in an old mason jar like it was the most important thing she'd done all day. We sat down. For the first 5 minutes, nobody really spoke. Forks scraped against plates. Wine glasses clinked. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is trying not to break something fragile. Ethan kept his eyes on his food, pushing a piece of lasagna around like it might tell him what to say. He was 29 going on 30. But tonight he looked like the scared kid who used to hide under the kitchen table when his parents argued about money. Laura kept glancing at me, then at him, then back at her plate. Her smile too bright, too careful. I took a slow sip of wine and set the glass down. I read the letter today, I said. The room went still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Laura's hand tightened around the stem of her glass. I read every word, I continued. The part about telling you I'm proud of you. The part about not letting Laura pretend she's okay. All of it. Ethan's eyes filled fast. He blinked hard, trying to shove the tears back down where they belonged, the way I'd taught him since he was 10. Men in our family didn't cry at dinner tables. Not until tonight. Dad. His voice cracked on the single syllable. I looked at my son, really looked, and saw the weight he'd been carrying. The guilt of changing the locks. The fear that he'd done the wrong thing, even though I'd begged him to do exactly that. The love that made him do it anyway. I reached across the table and put my hand on his wrist. His skin was warm. Alive. Still here. I'm proud of you, son. The words came out rough, like they'd been stuck in my throat for 32 years. Ethan's shoulders started to shake. He tried to hold it together, but the dam broke anyway. Big, silent tears rolled down his cheeks and dropped onto the lasagna he'd worked so hard on. Laura let out a soft sound, half laugh, half sob, and covered her mouth with both hands. I kept my hand on Ethan's wrist. I mean it. You did the hardest thing I ever asked anyone to do. You protected me from myself. That took guts. Real guts. He tried to speak but couldn't. Instead, he just nodded. Over and over. Like the words were too big to fit inside his chest. Laura reached for my other hand. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was strong. For the first time in months, the three of us sat there together, not as the family that was falling apart, but as the family that was still choosing to hold on. I felt something loosen in my chest, not the disease, not the fear, but the old, stubborn armor I'd worn for decades. The need to be the strong one, the one who fixed everything, the one who never needed anyone. Tonight, I let myself need them. We talked then. Not about the house or the diagnosis or the future. We talked about the time Ethan was 8 and tried to build a treehouse in the backyard and ended up with a sprained wrist and a story we still laugh about. We talked about the summer Laura and I drove Route 66 with a broken air conditioner and 3 cases of warm soda. We laughed until our sides hurt. And for a little while, the apartment felt like home again. The lasagna grew cold on our plates. Nobody cared. I was in the middle of telling the story about the duck that got loose in the truck last weekend when a sharp knock sounded at the door. 3 firm raps. Deliberate. We all turned. Ethan wiped his eyes quickly and stood up. Laura glanced at me, a question in her eyes. I shrugged. I wasn't expecting anyone. Ethan opened the door. There stood Hank Whitaker, my best friend since the army. Retired firefighter. The man who could fix anything with duct tape and stubbornness. He held a plain white envelope in his big, scarred hands. Same handwriting as the one in my jacket pocket. Hank looked past Ethan, straight at me, and gave a small nod. Conrad called me, he said simply. Said you might need this tonight. And a friend more than a lawyer. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and held out the second envelope, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My heart gave one hard, steady beat. Hank Whitaker stood in the doorway like a man who'd walked through 1,000 burning buildings and knew exactly how much silence a moment like this needed. He didn't smile. He didn't offer awkward condolences. He just stepped inside, closed the door behind him with a soft click, and held out the plain white envelope like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Marcus called me this afternoon," he said, voice low and steady. "Told me you might need this tonight more than you'd need another lawyer. Said you'd asked me to be here when you read it." I took the envelope. Same handwriting, same deliberate calm of the man I used to be. Page 2. Hank didn't ask if I wanted privacy. He simply pulled out the chair beside me at the dining table, sat down, and folded his big scarred hands on the wood. Laura and Ethan stayed quiet. They understood. This one was for me first. I opened it. The second page started mid-sentence. Like the man who wrote it 8 months ago, knew exactly how the first letter would land, and had deliberately left the door open at the end. And before you get too comfortable thinking you've got the whole picture, there's something I didn't put in the first letter. Something I couldn't put there because Laura might have found it. This part isn't for her yet. This part is for you. I slowed down. The apartment lights suddenly felt too bright. I've been keeping something since that second appointment with Dr. Ellis. The one I went to alone, the one I told everyone was just a follow-up about blood pressure. My stomach tightened. She told me the rate of progression in my case is significantly slower than average. 40% slower, Jack. She used those exact words. If you manage stress, stay socially engaged, keep doing the things that light your brain up, hunting, building, being outside on the water, there's a realistic possibility of several more years of high function before any major decline. I stopped breathing for a second. Several years. I didn't tell Laura because back in March she was already barely holding herself together. I didn't tell Ethan because he would have spent 6 hours on Google and come back with 17 conflicting studies in a spreadsheet. I needed to sit with it myself first. Decide what it meant. Decide what to do with it. Here's what I decided. The house needed to go regardless. Not because I'm disappearing tomorrow, but because the upkeep was becoming a weight neither of you needed to carry. I wanted to make that call while it was still mine to make. Clean. No drama. No last-minute fighting. But Jack, listen to me. This is not the ending. This is the intermission. I set the page down for a second and looked across the table at Hank. He was watching me with that steady, unhurried patience of a man who has sat with people in the worst moments of their lives and learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not leave. "You knew?" I asked. "Broad strokes," Hank said quietly. "Marcus gave me enough to know you'd need a friend sitting across from you when you got to the middle of that page." I picked the letter back up. "What I need you to do with this information is not spiral. I know your first instinct will be to call Marcus. Restructure everything. Start making new plans. That's the logistics brain talking. Right now I need you to tell it to sit down. What I actually need you to do is this. Tell Laura the real numbers. Tell her first. Always Laura first. She's been carrying a grief that's heavier than it needs to be. She thinks she's already losing you. She deserves to know she still has more of you than she thought. Tell Ethan too. But Laura first. And then Jack. Pay attention. I need you to do something you have never been good at. I need you to receive. You've spent 66 years giving, providing, managing, fixing, being the one who holds it together so nobody else has to. The idea of being on the other end of that probably feels like humiliation to you, like losing. It isn't losing. It's just a different kind of strength. The kind that lets other people be strong for you. The kind that says, I trust you enough to need you. Laura has been waiting her entire marriage for you to need her. Let her. And Ethan. Ethan just needs his father present. Not performing, not managing, just present. Whatever version of present you can give him, give it fully. That is all he has ever wanted from you. You've always known that. I turned the page over. There was one last paragraph, written slightly smaller, like he'd almost forgotten it, and then caught himself at the last second. P.S. Go back to the lake. Not to escape. Not to hide. but because you deserve a place that's just yours. A place where you're just a man with a shotgun and a duck call and nothing to manage. Everybody needs a place like that. Yours is still out there. I folded the letter slowly. My hands were steady, but my chest felt like someone had cracked it open and let the light in for the first time in months. Hank didn't say anything. He just sat there, solid as the old oak beams I used to frame houses with. The same man who'd pulled me out of a frozen lake 20 years ago, and never once brought it up afterward. I looked at the envelope, then at the table where Laura and Ethan were still waiting in the next room, pretending they weren't listening. The news wasn't a miracle. The disease was still there, but 40% slower. Several more years of high function. It changed everything. I felt the weight I'd been carrying shift. Not gone. Just shared. I stood up, slipped the second page into my jacket beside the first, and looked at Hank. Laura needs to hear this first, I said. Hank gave a single nod. The kind that meant he'd already known that was exactly what I would say. I slipped the second page back into the envelope, the paper still warm from my hands, and looked across the table at Hank. Laura needs to hear this first, I said. Hank gave me that single, steady nod he'd perfected over 30 years of walking into burning buildings. He didn't offer advice. He didn't pat me on the back. He just stood up, squeezed my shoulder once, and headed toward the living room where Laura and Ethan were pretending they hadn't been listening to every word. I stepped out onto the small balcony off Ethan's apartment. The October night air hit me cool and clean, carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from someone's backyard fire pit. The city lights of Minneapolis stretched out below like scattered stars, but up here it still felt almost private, almost like the old porch on the lake. I leaned on the railing and called back through the open sliding door, voice low but clear. Laura, can you come out here for a minute? She appeared almost immediately, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. She stepped onto the balcony and pulled the door halfway closed behind her, leaving just enough of a gap so the warm light from inside spilled across the concrete floor. Her sweater looked too thin for the chill, but she didn't seem to notice. I didn't speak right away. I just reached out and took her hand the way I used to on long drives when the kids were little and the road stretched out forever. Her fingers were cold. I rubbed my thumb across her knuckles, trying to warm them. Jack? Her voice was soft, almost afraid of what I might say next. I pulled the envelope from my jacket and held it between us. The handwriting caught the light from inside my own handwriting from 8 months ago, when I was still the man who could fix anything with a plan and a pen. I read the second page, I said. Hank brought it tonight. She waited. That was Laura, always waiting for me to finish my thoughts, even when the silence hurt. I told her everything. Not the clinical version, the real one. How Dr. Ellis had pulled me aside after the second round of tests and said the words, significantly slower than average. How 40% slower could mean several more years of good days. How I'd kept it from her because I didn't want her carrying even more hope only to have it taken away later. How I'd sold the house anyway because the upkeep was already becoming too heavy. But that this wasn't the end. It was the intermission. I told her the hardest part. That the man who wrote those letters had begged me the future, me to stop pretending I didn't need her. Laura didn't interrupt. She just stood there, eyes locked on mine, the city lights reflecting in the tears that were already starting to form. When I finally ran out of words, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic far below, and the soft rustle of dry leaves skittering across the balcony floor. Then she started to cry. Not the quiet, polite tears she'd been holding back for months. These were big, messy, shoulder-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and exhausted and relieved all at once. She pressed her face into my chest and held on like she was afraid the wind might take me if she let go. I wrapped my arms around her, really wrapped them. Not the half-hug of a man who was still trying to be strong. I buried my face in her hair and breathed in the familiar scent of her shampoo and the faint trace of the lavender hand cream she'd used every night for 34 years. I thought I was already losing you. She whispered against my shirt, voice breaking. Every time you forgot where you put your keys, every time you stared at the lake like you were trying to memorize it, I thought this was it. I know, I said into her hair. I'm sorry I let you carry that alone. She pulled back just enough to look up at me. Her eyes were shining, red-rimmed, but there was something new in them now, something lighter. Several more years? She asked, like she needed to hear me say it out loud one more time. Several more years, I confirmed. If I stopped trying to manage everything, if I let you and Ethan help, if I actually receive for once, instead of always giving. A small, watery laugh escaped her. You? Receive? That might be the real miracle. I smiled, a real one, not the practiced one I'd been wearing for months. The letter called me out on it. Said I was never as tough as I pretended. Just had good posture. Mine. For the letter. Mine. A plunce. She laughed again, softer this time, and rested her forehead against mine. The city lights blurred behind her. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something I had to outrun. We stood like that for a long while, the cold air wrapping around us, her tears slowly drying on my shirt. Neither of us wanted to go back inside yet. The moment felt too fragile, too important to share with even the warm light of the apartment. Finally, I pulled back just enough to look at her. Tomorrow, I said, voice rough but sure. We start over. Laura's forehead was still pressed against mine, the city lights blurring behind her. When something inside me cracked open and let the light in, I pulled back just enough to look at her properly. Her eyes were shining, red-rimmed from crying, but there was a new softness there now, a lightness that hadn't been present in months. The wind off the balcony carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't feel like something I had to outrun. Tomorrow, I said again, my voice rough but sure. We start over. She let out a small, watery laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and bubbles up before you can stop it. You? Starting over? Jack Harlan? The man who planned his own disappearance like it was a bridge project? The laugh caught me off guard. It was real. Not the polite, careful one she'd been giving me for months to keep the peace. This one had teeth. It had history. It was the same laugh she used to give me when I came home covered in concrete dust and tried to act like I hadn't just spent 12 hours arguing with a stubborn inspector. I felt the corners of my mouth twitch. Then I was laughing too. A short, surprised bark that turned into something deeper. Something that shook my shoulders and made my eyes sting. We stood there on that tiny balcony. Two 60-something fools holding each other and laughing like idiots while the Minneapolis night wrapped around us. It was the first real laugh we'd shared in months. Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still chuckling. You have no idea how long I've been waiting for you to say something like that. I need you. Not I've got this. Just, I need you. I rested my chin on top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. The letter called me out on it. Said I was never as tough as I pretended. Just had good posture. She laughed again, softer this time, and pulled back to look at me. Her fingers traced the line of my jaw, the same way she used to do on long drives when Ethan was small and asleep in the back seat. Well, your posture is still pretty good for a man who just found out he gets several more years. Several more years. The words hung between us like a promise neither of us had dared to hope for. I took her hand and led her to the two plastic chairs we'd dragged out here months ago. We sat side by side, shoulders touching, looking out over the scattered lights of the city. The cold air felt good on my face. Clean. Like a fresh start. I kept it from you because I didn't want you carrying false hope, I said quietly. But the letter said I had to stop managing everything. Stop protecting you from the truth. So here it is. 40% slower. Several more years of good days if I stop trying to be the strong, silent type and actually let you and Ethan help. Laura squeezed my hand. You know what the scariest part was for me? Not the diagnosis. It was watching you try to carry it alone, watching you stand on that porch last night and realize you'd planned your own disappearance and then forgotten you'd done it. I thought I was watching the man I loved disappear right in front of me. I nodded slowly. I was disappearing, but not the way I thought. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. The kind of silence that only comes after years of marriage when you don't need to fill every gap. Somewhere below us, a car horn honked, and a dog barked in reply. Normal city sounds. Normal life sounds. They felt like a gift tonight. After a while, Laura spoke again, her voice lighter. So what does start over look like for Jack Harlan? Are we talking about building another house? Because I'm not sure my back can handle another set of blueprints at 2 a.m. I grinned. No more blueprints. No more managing. The letter said I need to receive. So tomorrow, we go look at that little cabin spot up by Lake Michigan that Ethan mentioned last month. The one with the old dock and the pine trees. Nothing fancy. Just 4 walls and a roof we can build together. Slowly. With help. Laura's eyes lit up. You mean you're actually going to let Ethan hold the power saw? I'm going to let him hold the whole damn project if he wants, I said. And I'm going to sit there and let him. And let you. And maybe even let Hank boss me around for once. She laughed again, that bright, genuine sound that used to fill our old lake house every Sunday morning. It echoed off the balcony railing and made something warm bloom in my chest. We stayed out there until the cold finally drove us inside. Ethan and Hank were waiting in the living room, pretending they hadn't been hovering near the door. When we walked in, Ethan took one look at our faces and his shoulders relaxed for the first time all night. Everything okay? He asked. I looked at my son, then at my wife, then at the best friend who'd shown up with a second letter, and no questions asked. Better than okay, I said. Tomorrow we start over. And for the first time in months, the words didn't feel like the end of something. They felt like the beginning. The next morning came earlier than any of us expected, but none of us complained. We loaded up my old pickup truck before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Sleeping bags, a cooler packed with Laura's midnight-made sandwiches, 2 axes, the chainsaw, a box of nails, and enough coffee to keep 3 stubborn Harlans awake for a week. Ethan tossed the last duffel into the bed and slammed the tailgate. Laura climbed into the middle of the bench seat like she used to when Ethan was small, and we'd pile into the truck for weekend drives just to get out of the house. The cab smelled like pine air freshener, motor oil, and the faint trace of last night's lasagna. I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life with that familiar, deep growl I'd known for 15 years. For once, I didn't check the mirrors twice or adjust the rear view for the 10th time. I just put the truck in drive and headed east on the highway. The road unrolled in front of us like a long, golden promise. Fields of harvested corn gave way to thick stands of maple and oak, still blazing red and orange in the October sun. Every few miles, Ethan would point out something small. A red-tailed hawk riding a thermal, a white-tailed deer frozen at the tree line, the way the morning light painted a weathered barn in perfect gold. I didn't correct his route or tell him the faster way. I just listened, letting the words settle between us. Laura rested her hand on my knee, the same casual touch she'd given me 1,000 times on 1,000 drives. This time, it felt different. Lighter, like we were carrying the same weight together instead of me pretending I could shoulder it alone. About 2 hours in, Ethan cleared his throat. Dad. About the house. I still feel like I stole something from you. I kept my eyes on the road, but I reached over and squeezed his shoulder once, hard enough for him to feel it. You didn't steal anything, son. You followed the instructions of a man who was scared he'd forget how to be a father. That man was me, and I'm damn proud of you for doing it. Ethan swallowed hard. The cab went quiet, except for the steady hum of the tires and the low country station playing softly on the radio. After a minute, he spoke again, voice rough around the edges. I was terrified every time I signed those papers. I kept thinking, what if he wakes up one day and hates me for this? Laura turned in her seat so she could see both of us. He doesn't hate you. He never could. He planned this so we wouldn't have to watch him disappear piece by piece. And now, we get more pieces than we thought we would. I felt my throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was something warmer. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. I'd spent months trying to protect them from the truth, and all it had done was push them further away. Today, for the first time, I was letting them walk beside me instead of in front of me. We stopped for gas somewhere outside Green Bay. While Ethan filled the tank, Laura and I stood by the tailgate stretching our legs. The air smelled sharper here, closer to the big water. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. "You really meant it last night?" she asked quietly. "About letting us help? About not managing everything?" I nodded. The letter didn't give me much choice. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending I've still got everything under control. Turns out that was never as impressive as I thought it was. She smiled against my jacket. "Welcome to the club, old man." When Ethan climbed back in, I didn't take the wheel right away. I looked at him and held out the keys. "You drive the next stretch." His eyebrows shot up. "Me? You never let anyone else drive this truck." "Today's a day for firsts," I said. He took the keys like they might burn him, but he was grinning the whole time he adjusted the seat. For the next hour, I sat passenger side and watched my son drive the highway with careful confidence. I didn't offer advice. I didn't grip the door handle. I just sat there and let him be the man he was becoming. We crossed into Michigan just after noon. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler. And then finally, we caught the first silver flash of Lake Michigan through the pines. The road narrowed, turned to gravel, and wound down toward the small clearing Ethan had found online. Tall white pines stood like silent sentinels. The water stretched out forever, cold and blue, and completely indifferent to diagnoses or timelines. We parked and climbed out. The wind off the lake carried the clean scent of water and pine needles. For a long minute, none of us spoke. We just stood there taking it in. This wasn't the $720,000 lake house with the perfect dock and the memories baked into every board. This was something smaller, simpler, ours to build from scratch. Ethan reached for the chainsaw in the bed of the truck and looked at me, waiting. I walked over, took the saw from his hands, checked the chain, then handed it right back. "Your turn," I said. "First cut's yours." He looked at the saw, then at me, eyes wide. "Dad, you sure?" I smiled, the real kind. The one that didn't need good posture to hold it up. "Positive." "Show me what you've got, son." The chainsaw felt heavy in Ethan's hands, but he held it like a man who had just been handed the keys to something bigger than himself. The blade glinted in the thin Michigan sunlight filtering through the tall white pines. Lake Michigan stretched out behind us, cold and endless, the waves whispering against the rocky shore like they were giving us permission to begin. I stepped back and crossed my arms, the old flannel shirt pulling tight across my shoulders. "First cut's yours, son. Right there on that big pine, nice and straight. Don't rush it." Ethan looked at me, then at the tree, then back at me. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to watch me build birdhouses in the garage, eyes wide with wonder. Today, those eyes held something new, determination, mixed with the fear of messing up in front of his old man. Hank Whitaker stood a few feet away, sleeves rolled up, grinning like a kid who'd just been handed free tickets to the county fair. "You heard your father, Ethan. Nice and straight. I'll spot you." The saw roared to life. The sound ripped through the quiet clearing and sent a flock of crows exploding out of the pines. Ethan leaned in, teeth clenched, and the blade bit into the wood. Sawdust flew in a golden cloud. The trunk gave a deep, satisfying crack as the tree started to lean, then fell exactly where we needed it, right across the spot we'd marked for the main support beam. The echo rolled across the lake and died away. Ethan killed the saw, breathing hard, and looked at me. I nodded once. "Not bad. Not bad at all." For the next 6 hours, we worked like men who had something to prove to each other and to themselves. Hank and I showed Ethan how to notch the logs the old way, the way my grandfather taught me on a cabin up in the Boundary Waters, when I was barely older than Ethan is now. We used the draw knife to peel the bark, the scent of fresh pine filling the air so thick it almost made you drunk. Laura kept us fed and watered, moving between us with thermoses of coffee and sandwiches, her laugh mixing with the steady rhythm of hammers and the occasional curse when someone hit their thumb. By late afternoon, we had the first 2 walls framed and standing. The cabin was nothing fancy yet, just a simple 12 by 16 footprint with a small porch facing the water, but it was ours. Every log had our sweat on it. Every notch told a story. The sun was dipping low, painting the lake in streaks of orange and pink, when we finally called it a day. Hank built a fire in the stone ring we'd made earlier. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing up into the deepening twilight. We sat on the half-finished logs, boots muddy, hands blistered, and passed around a bottle of the good whiskey Hank had smuggled in his duffel. Laura leaned against my shoulder, her head fitting perfectly in that same spot it had occupied for 34 years. Ethan poked at the fire with a long stick, sending another shower of sparks skyward. For a while, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the fire, the gentle lap of waves, and the occasional night bird calling across the water. It was the kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. I took a slow sip of whiskey and let the warmth spread through my chest. "You know," I said quietly, "my grandfather built a cabin just like this up north when I was 10. He let me swing the hammer exactly once. I missed the nail and hit my thumb so hard I cried like a baby. He didn't laugh. He just wrapped my thumb in his bandana and said, 'Pain's the price of learning, boy. Keep swinging.'" Ethan looked up from the fire, eyes reflecting the flames. "Did you keep swinging?" "Every damn day after that," I said with a short laugh. "Built half the birdhouses in the county before I turned 12. Still have the scar on my thumb to prove it." Laura smiled against my shoulder. Hank chuckled low in his throat, the sound like gravel under tires. "Sounds about right for a Harlan man. Stubborn as a railroad tie." We talked, then real talk, the kind that only happens around a campfire when the day's work has worn away all the polish. Ethan told us about the startup that fell apart, and how scared he'd been to call me for help. Laura shared how she'd sat in the car outside the real estate office the day they signed the papers for the lake house, crying so hard she couldn't see the road home. I listened more than I spoke. For once, I didn't try to fix anything. I just let their words land and stayed present. The fire had burned down to glowing coals when Ethan finally asked the question that had been sitting between us all day. "Dad?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Do you still remember everything today?" I looked at my son across the fire. The flames painted his face in warm light and deep shadow. I thought about the letter, about the 40% slower progression, about the man I used to be who wrote those words because he was afraid of becoming someone else. I smiled, tired, honest, and real. "Today I remember everything that matters," I said. "And that's enough." The night settled around us, the lake whispering its endless song against the shore. Tomorrow, we would keep building. Tomorrow, we would keep learning how to need each other. But tonight, with the fire dying and the stars coming out one by one overhead, we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The fire had burned low, reduced to a glowing bed of red-orange coals that still pushed back the sharp October chill, rolling in off Lake Michigan. Sparks drifted lazily upward, tiny fireflies trying to join the real stars scattered across the black sky. I sat on one of the half-finished cabin logs, boots stretched toward the warmth, the faint taste of Hank's good whiskey still lingering on my tongue like a quiet promise. Ethan's question hung in the cool night air between us. Simple but heavy. "Dad, do you still remember everything today?" I looked across the dying flames at my son. The firelight painted his face in warm flickers and deep shadows, making him look both like the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders and the grown man he had become. Laura sat pressed against my side, her shoulder a steady, familiar warmth. Hank leaned back on his elbows a few feet away, quiet as always, giving the moment the space it deserved. I took a slow, deep breath. The night air filled my lungs cold, clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin, damp earth, and the distant, rhythmic lap of waves against the rocky shore. Today I remember everything that matters, I said, my voice low and steady. The same tone I used to use on job sites when explaining a complicated set of blueprints to a crew that needed to trust me. I remember the day you were born, Ethan. I remember the way your mother looked at me in that delivery room, like I'd somehow hung the moon and all the stars just for her. I remember the first time I took you fishing on the old lake when you were 6. You caught a sunfish so tiny we threw it back and laughed until our sides hurt. I remember the night 8 months ago when I sat you and your mom down and asked you both to promise me something I was terrified I'd fight you on later. I paused. The fire popped softly, sending another small shower of sparks skyward. I remember all of that today, I continued. And I remember something the letter reminded me of, something I've been running from for a long time. I've spent 66 years being the guy who fixes everything. The guy who plans every detail. The guy who makes sure nobody else ever has to carry the weight. I thought that made me strong. Turns out, it just made me lonely. Laura's hand found mine in the dark. She didn't squeeze hard. She just held on, letting me know without words that she was right there, exactly where she'd always been. Ethan stared into the glowing coals, his face serious. So what do we do now, Dad? How do we keep going? I smiled, small and tired and honest. We do the hardest thing I've ever had to learn in my life. We slow down. We let each other help. I stop pretending I don't need you to. And you stop pretending you don't need me to need you. That's it. No big speeches. No perfect plan. Just this. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, raw, vulnerable in a way the old Jack Harlan would never have allowed. But they also felt right, like the final piece of a bridge I'd been building my whole life without ever realizing the true purpose. I looked at my son again, the firelight dancing in his eyes. You asked if I remember everything today. The truth is, some days I won't. That's the hand we've been dealt, and there's no blueprint that can change it. But here's what I want you to remember on the days when my memory starts to slip. This right here, sitting by a fire we built together. On land we're turning into something new with our own hands. This is what matters. Not the big house we lost. Not the perfect plan I used to make. Just us. Being present. Even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy. Ethan's eyes glistened in the firelight. He didn't try to hide the tears this time. He just nodded, slow and serious. Like he was taking an oath he intended to keep for the rest of his life. I turned to Laura, my voice softer now. And you. You've been carrying this longer and heavier than I ever knew. I'm sorry I let you do that alone. From now on, when the forgetting gets louder, I want you to remind me of this night. Remind me that I asked for help. That I wanted it. That I needed it. She leaned her head against my shoulder again, her hair brushing my cheek. I will, she whispered. Every single day, Jack. Every single day. The fire had almost died now, reduced to a soft red glow. Hank stood up quietly, stretched his big frame, and muttered something about checking the truck one last time. He gave us all a small nod that said he was giving us space, then disappeared toward the gravel lot, his footsteps crunching softly on the pine needles. Ethan got up too. He walked over to the small pile of gear we'd brought, pulled out the thick wool blanket Laura had packed, shook it out with care, and draped it gently over my shoulders. He tucked the edges around me like I was the one who needed protecting now. I started to protest out of pure habit. I'm fine, son. Really? But the words died in my throat. Instead, I looked up at him and said the simplest, hardest thing I'd said all day. Thank you. Ethan's face softened in the firelight. He crouched down, poured the last of the coffee from the thermos into my metal cup, and handed it to me without being asked. Steam rose warm against my face, carrying the rich, familiar smell. Laura smiled softly beside me. Look at that. Jack Harlan actually letting someone take care of him. I took a slow sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest and into my bones. The lake whispered its endless song against the shore in the background. The tall pines creaked gently overhead in the night breeze. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel the urge to get up and fix something. I didn't feel the need to plan the next 10 steps, or check the weather forecast, or make sure everyone else was okay first. I just sat there wrapped in a blanket my son had placed on me, drinking coffee he had poured, with my wife's head resting on my shoulder and the fire dying gently in front of us. And in that quiet, perfect, ordinary moment, I realized something the old Jack would never have admitted out loud. This right here, right now, was what I had been waiting for my whole life. The morning light came soft and golden through the pines, painting the lake in pale silver and turning the frost on the grass into tiny diamonds. I woke up stiff but strangely rested. The wool blanket still draped over me from the night before. The fire had burned down to cold ash, but the memory of it and the words we'd shared still warmed something deep in my chest. Laura was already awake, sitting on the edge of the half-built porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed me one without a word, her fingers brushing mine a second longer than necessary. Her eyes were clear, the kind of clear that comes after a night of real tears and real hope. "Walk with me?" she asked quietly. I nodded. We left Ethan and Hank still snoring in their sleeping bags and headed down the narrow path that wound along the shoreline. The lake was calm, the water lapping gently against the rocks like it was in no hurry to be anywhere. Our boots crunched on the gravel and fallen pine needles. For the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. We just walked side by side, shoulders occasionally brushing, the way we used to do on Sunday mornings back at the old lake house before life got complicated. After a while, Laura slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were warm from the coffee mug. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began. Her voice was soft but steady, the same voice that had talked me through 3 decades of job stress, through Ethan's teenage rebellions, through every quiet fear we'd ever faced together, about receiving instead of always giving, about letting us help. I squeezed her hand. I meant every word. She stopped walking and turned to face me. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair and made it shine like it belonged there. 34 years of marriage, and she was still the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "Jack Harlan," she said, looking straight into my eyes, "I have loved you through every version of you. The young hothead who thought he could build the world with his bare hands. The man who worked 80-hour weeks so our son could have everything. The man who sat at our kitchen table 8 months ago and tried to protect us by planning his own disappearance. And now, this version, the one who's learning how to need us." Her voice caught for just a second, but she kept going. "I was so scared I was losing you. Not because of the diagnosis, I can handle the diagnosis. I was scared because you were disappearing behind all those walls you built to keep us safe. Last night, when you let Ethan put that blanket on you, when you let him pour your coffee, I saw you again. The real you. The one I fell in love with." I felt my throat tighten. The lake stretched out behind her, endless and peaceful, reflecting the pale blue sky. "I'm ready, Jack," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm ready to walk every step of this with you. The good days. The days when you forget where you put your keys. The days when you remember everything. And the days when you don't. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not pretending anymore. I'm here. Fully here. And I need you to let me be here." Tears stung the corners of my eyes. I didn't try to blink them away. I just pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her the way I should have done months ago. She fit against me perfectly, the same way she always had. Her head tucked under my chin, her hands pressed against my back, like she was anchoring both of us to this moment. "I'm sorry it took me so long to let you," I whispered into her hair. She shook her head against my chest. "You're here now. That's what matters. We stood like that for a long time. the lake whispering its quiet approval, the wind moving through the pines overhead. No big speeches, no perfect plans, just the two of us, holding each other on a rocky shoreline in Michigan, choosing each other all over again. Eventually we started walking again, slower this time, her arm linked through mine. The sun climbed higher, warming our faces. I told her about the second letters P, S, the part about coming back to the lake not to escape but because I deserved a place that was just mine. She smiled and said we'd make sure this new cabin became that place for both of us. When we finally turned back toward the clearing, I could already hear the distant sound of the chainsaw starting up again. Ethan and Hank were awake and working. The cabin was taking shape, walls rising, roof beams going into place. Something real and solid being built by the people who loved me most. Laura squeezed my arm one more time before we stepped back into the clearing. "I'm ready, Jack," she said again, softer this time, just for me. For all of it. The whole journey. Together. I looked at her. At the cabin rising behind her. At my son and my best friend already hard at work. And I felt something settle deep in my bones. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like something I had to fight. It felt like something we were going to build, one log, one laugh, one honest conversation at a time. The final day on the lake broke clear and cold, the kind of crisp Michigan October morning that makes every breath feel sharp and alive. Frost sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds, and the first rays of sunlight painted the surface of Lake Michigan in pale silver and soft gold. The cabin stood almost complete in front of us, 4 solid walls of fresh pine, a sturdy pitched roof, and the small front porch facing the water as if it had always been meant to stand right there on the shoreline. Today we would finish it. Today we would turn it from a project into a home. We started at first light. Ethan and Hank mixed the soft gray paint while Laura and I laid out brushes, rollers, and drop cloths on the dew-wet grass. The color we had chosen looked perfect against the tall white pines, standing like silent guardians around the clearing. I watched my son roll the first long, steady stroke down the front wall, his movements careful but confident, the same focused way he had swung the chainsaw on the very first day. No one spoke much at first. The only sounds were the soft hiss of paint rollers on raw wood, the occasional tap of a hammer driving the last nails, and the steady, rhythmic lap of the lake against the rocks behind us. By mid-morning, the walls were done. The gray paint glowed softly in the rising sun, clean and warm against the deep green of the pines. Hank climbed the ladder with the simple wooden sign we had carved together the night before. He had done the lettering himself with those big, scarred hands that once pulled people from burning buildings. Harlan Haven. It read nothing fancy, no grand design. Just our name, and the quiet promise that this place had been built with love, sweat, and second chances. Laura stepped back, hands on her hips, a smear of paint across her cheek like war paint earned in battle. She tilted her head, studying the finished walls. "It looks like home," she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve and broke into a wide grin. "It feels like home." I stood a little apart from them in the cool grass, hands in my pockets, and let the moment wash over me. This wasn't the grand $720,000 lake house with the perfect dock and decades of memories baked into every board. This was smaller, humbler, built by our own hands in just 3 short days. Every log, every notch, every brushstroke carried the story of a family learning how to need each other again. The old Jack would have been measuring, planning, worrying about the next 10 steps. The man I was becoming simply stood there and felt grateful. We spent the last hour cleaning up folding tarps, rinsing brushes in the cold lake water until our fingers went numb, stacking leftover lumber neatly under the trees. Then Laura surprised us with the picnic basket she had packed that morning before anyone else was awake. Cold fried chicken, fresh bread still warm from the small camp stove, crisp apples, and a bottle of the same red wine we had shared the night we decided to come here. We spread an old plaid blanket on the grass facing the water and sat together, legs stretched out, the finished cabin rising proudly behind us. The sun climbed higher, warming our faces. Hank told old army stories that made Ethan laugh until he was holding his sides. Laura leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and for a long while we just ate and talked and let the lake do the rest of the talking. The water sparkled, the pines whispered overhead, and the air smelled of fresh paint, pine resin, and the faint smoke still rising from last night's fire ring. When the food was gone and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, I stood up. The others stayed seated on the blanket, watching me as I walked a few steps away from the group and turned to face the cabin. It was finished. The soft gray walls caught the late afternoon light and glowed with quiet pride. The white trim shone clean and bright. The small porch waited with two simple rocking chairs we had brought from Ethan's apartment. The hand-carved sign, Harlan Haven, hung perfectly above the door. Smoke still curled lazily from the stone fire ring where we had cooked breakfast. Everything about it felt right. I stood there for a long time, just looking. The wind off the lake moved gently through the pines, carrying the clean scent of water and evergreen. I thought about the locked door on my old porch, the letter I had written to myself 8 months ago, the fear I had carried like an invisible weight, the laughter around the fire 2 nights ago, the way Ethan had draped that blanket over my shoulders without being asked, the way Laura had held me on the shoreline yesterday morning and told me she was ready for all of it. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but they weren't sad. They were the kind that come when you realize you have been given more time than you thought you deserved, not just more days, but more real days filled with meaning. I turned back to my family. They were still sitting on the blanket, smiling, waiting. The sun painted the lake in streaks of gold and rose behind them. The cabin stood solid and real, and ours. I cleared my throat and said the only words that felt right in that moment. Today, I remember everything, and in the golden light of that Michigan afternoon, with my wife, my son, and my oldest friend beside me, I finally understood what the letter had been trying to tell me all along. This right here was more than enough. The sun was sinking low over Lake Michigan, turning the water into a vast sheet of liquid gold that shimmered and danced under the dying light. The finished cabin stood proudly behind us on the grassy clearing, its soft gray walls glowing warmly in the amber sunset, the hand-carved sign, Harlan Haven, catching the last rays like a quiet promise. We sat together on the old plaid blanket spread across the grass, Laura on my left, her shoulder pressed gently against mine, Ethan on my right, and Hank a little farther back leaning against the trunk of a tall white pine. The air had that perfect, crisp October chill, the kind that makes you pull your jacket closer and feel deeply grateful for the people sitting beside you. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle lap of waves against the rocky shoreline and the soft rustle of pine needles overhead in the evening breeze. I held Laura's hand, my thumb tracing slow, absent circles on her skin, and looked out at the endless water. Today we had finished something real, something that wasn't built from old blueprints or old fears, but from new beginnings, shared sweat, and the kind of love that shows up when plans fall apart. I cleared my throat and broke the comfortable silence. "I want to tell you something," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, but steady and sure. Not the kind of speech I used to make back when I thought I had all the answers. Not another plan or schedule. Just the truth I've been learning these past few days. They all turned toward me. Ethan set down the stick he'd been idly poking the ground with. Laura squeezed my hand a little tighter. Hank gave me that small, knowing nod that meant he was listening with his whole heart, the same way he had when he delivered the second letter. I spent most of my life believing that being strong meant carrying everything alone. I began building the big house, planning every detail of the future, making sure no one else ever had to worry or carry the weight. I thought that was love protecting you from the hard parts. But the letter I wrote to myself 8 months ago showed me something I couldn't see back then. Real strength isn't carrying the load by yourself. It's trusting the people you love enough to let them carry some of it with you. I looked at Ethan first, meeting his eyes across the blanket. "Son, When you changed those locks on the old house, I thought my world was ending. But you were doing exactly what I asked you to do when I was still clear enough to ask. You protected me from becoming the stubborn old man who would have fought you every step of the way. I'm not just proud of you. I'm grateful. And I'm sorry it took me so long to say it out loud, face to face. Ethan's eyes glistened in the golden light. He nodded once, swallowing hard. But he didn't look away. I turned to Laura, my voice softening. And you? You've been carrying this diagnosis, this quiet fear, this whole heavy weight, longer and heavier than I ever realized. I kept things from you thinking I was protecting you. I was wrong. The strongest thing I've done in 34 years of marriage was finally letting you in, completely on that balcony the other night. Thank you for waiting for me to get there. Thank you for still choosing me, every version of me. Even the ones that are starting to forget. Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them, the same gentle, steady smile that had carried us through every storm we'd ever faced. I looked out at the lake again, watching the golden light slowly fade into soft rose and deep indigo. The letter told me to receive instead of always giving. I thought that would feel like weakness. Turns out, it feels like freedom. I don't have to be the man who has all the answers anymore. I don't have to plan every tomorrow or manage every detail. Some days I might forget where I put my keys. Some days I might forget a name or a story. But here's what I won't forget, what I want all of you to remember, even if I do. This right here is what matters. Not the big house we lost. Not the perfect plan I used to make. Just us, sitting by a lake we didn't own yesterday, in a cabin we built with our own hands today, choosing each other again tomorrow. I paused, letting the words settle in the evening air. The lake whispered softly against the shore. Alzheimer's is still coming. I know that. But it's moving slower than we feared. And even when the forgetting gets louder, I want you to remember that the man who wrote those letters loved you enough to build you a safety net. And the man sitting here right now loves you enough to say thank you for using it. The sun touched the horizon. The lake turned to fire for one perfect, fleeting moment. I opened my arms. Come here. Laura moved first, wrapping her arms around me tightly. Ethan joined a second later, his long arms enclosing both of us. Hank stood up and stepped in, one big hand resting solidly on my shoulder, the other on Ethan's back. The four of us stayed like that, a small, imperfect, unbreakable circle on the grass, while the sky slowly turned from gold to deep indigo and the first stars began to appear overhead. No one cried loudly. No one needed to. The tears that fell were quiet ones, the kind that come when you realize you've been given more time than you thought you deserved, more real moments, more honest conversations, more chances to love and be loved exactly as you are. I closed my eyes and breathed in the smell of pine, lake water, and the people I loved most in the world. Today I remember everything. I whispered again, softer this time, just for them. And in that moment, with my family holding me close and the finished cabin standing behind us like a quiet promise, I finally understood the deepest lesson the letter had been trying to teach me all along. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You don't have to be strong all the time. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply let the people who love him back. The last light of the Michigan sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving Lake Michigan a vast, shimmering sheet of deep indigo that reflected the first stars appearing one by one overhead, like quiet promises in the night sky. I stood alone for a moment at the edge of the water, the finished cabin glowing softly behind me with the warm porch light we had left on. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles, the faint smoke from the dying fire ring, and the endless rhythmic whisper of waves against the rocky shoreline. My family waited on the old plaid blanket a few yards away, giving me this quiet minute to take it all in before we packed up and headed back to the real world. I looked out across the endless water and felt something settle deep in my chest. Not the heavy weight of old plans and old fears I had carried for so long, but something lighter, something warmer, something that finally felt like peace after months of quiet storm. Here's what I've learned in these past few days on this shoreline. The kind of lesson that doesn't come from any book or blueprint, but from standing on a porch with a key that no longer fits your own door and realizing you were the one who changed the lock. Getting older isn't about the gray hair or the knees that pop like bubble wrap every time you stand up. It's about the moment you finally understand that the strongest thing you can ever do is stop trying to carry the entire world on your shoulders alone. I spent 66 years believing that real strength meant control, building the big lake house with my own hands, planning every detail of the future, making sure my wife and son never had to worry or carry any of the weight. I thought I was protecting them. Instead, I was slowly pushing them away. The letter I wrote to myself 8 months ago, when I was still clear-headed enough to see the road ahead, showed me the truth I couldn't see back then. Real love isn't about shielding the people you care about from pain. It's about trusting them enough to let them walk through that pain right beside you. Alzheimer's is still here. It hasn't gone away, and it never will. But it's moving slower than we feared. 40% slower than the doctors first expected. And that small mercy has given us something far more precious than I ever dared to hope for. More time, more real days, more mornings like this one where I still remember everything that truly matters. And on the days when the forgetting grows louder and the memories start to slip through my fingers like sand, I want my family and anyone listening to this story to remember this simple truth. The man who planned his own disappearance 8 months ago did it because he loved them more than he knew how to say. The man standing here right now on this shoreline is learning, day by day, how to receive that love in return without feeling like he's failing. I turned back toward the cabin. Laura, Ethan, and Hank were watching me, their faces soft and patient in the gentle porch light. I walked over and sat down on the blanket with them. No big speeches, no final instructions, no more managing the moment. Just the four of us under the growing stars, the lake whispering its endless, steady song behind us, like it had been doing for centuries before we arrived and would continue long after we left. Laura rested her head on my shoulder, the way she used to on those long drives, when the world still felt manageable and completely ours. Ethan leaned in closer, his arm around my back in that quiet, protective way sons learn when they finally see their fathers as human. Hank gave me that small, knowing nod that said more than any words ever could. In that small, imperfect circle, I finally understood the deepest truth the letter had been trying to teach me all along. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You don't have to be strong every single day. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can ever do is simply open his hands, lay down the armor, and let the people who love him back exactly as he is. That's the lesson I'm carrying forward now. Not just for me, but for anyone listening who's ever felt the crushing weight of trying to hold everything together alone. Whether you're facing a difficult diagnosis, a painful loss, a plan that fell apart, or just the quiet fear that comes with watching the years slip by, you are not meant to carry it by yourself. Let your people in. Let them help. Let them love you on the good days and the hard days, even when you're forgetting names or stories, even when you're scared, even when you think you don't deserve it. Because the truth is, you do. If this story touched something deep in your heart tonight, if it reminded you to pick up the phone and call your parent, to hug your spouse a little tighter, to tell your child you're proud of them, even when they mess up, then I've done exactly what I set out to do when I started sharing these words. These stories aren't just about one man's diagnosis or one family's second chance. They're about all of us learning how to live fully while we still can, how to receive love instead of always giving it, and how to find beauty in the moments we have right now instead of waiting for the perfect plan. If this resonated with you, do one small thing for me before you go. Hit that like button so others who need to hear this can find it. Leave a comment below and tell me which part hit you the hardest. I read every single one, and your words mean more than you know. And if you want more real, raw, family-centered stories about love, loss, second chances, and learning how to let people in, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a guy like me who's still figuring it out one honest day at a time. Thank you for sitting here with me by this lake tonight. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. And wherever you are right now, remember this one simple thing. Today, You remember everything that truly matters. And that is more than enough.